Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at William James' Essays on Faith and Morals, edited by Ralph Barton Perry. An interesting thing about the way this book presents itself, it seems as if it's a book called Essays on Faith and Morals by William James, but William James never wrote or released any book by that name. This is, of course, a collection of essays that was assembled by Ralph Barton Perry and put out in this book. This book was released in 1962, long after William James had passed away. It collects his essays, but it doesn't collect them from a tremendous number of sources. They're all supposed to be essays that have to do with faith and morals, but it really draws a tremendous amount from The Will to Believe, because that had a number of essays, including The Will to Believe, but other ones as well, that had to do with things that related to ethics and morality and religion as well. And so from that book, Essays 1 through 6 are reprinted from The Will to Believe. And then Essays 7 and 9 are from Memories and Studies, which was, I believe, published after William James had passed away, that picked up a few of his essays that had not yet been published. So there's a few there. The Moral Equivalent of War is one of them, and The Energies of Men is another one. And then the remaining 3 essays are the 3 essays that make up Talks to Students. So really everything everything published in this book comes from 3 of William James's books: Will to Believe, Talks to Teachers, and Memories and Studies. Now, I don't want to address anything here from The Will to Believe. I've covered a few of these essays. I have not covered every one of these essays, but I have covered some of them: The Sentiment of Rationality, The Will to Believe, The Dilemma of Determinism. So what I want to talk about today is the stuff from Talks to Teachers, specifically the stuff from Talks to Students, which is included in Talks to Teachers. There are 3 essays in Talks to Students. One of them is The Gospel of Relaxation, which I talked about in my last William James episode. The other 2 essays from Talks to Students are A Certain Blindness, On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings, and What Makes a Life Significant. So those are the remaining 2 essays that I have not yet covered from Talks to Students, and those are the 2 essays that I want to address today. None of the other essays in here am I going to spend any time on, just those 2. But of course there will be more books in the future with some additional essays. I'm sure The Moral Equivalent of War will be addressed at some point, but that's not today. Today we're just doing these Talks to Students. And these are, like I said in the last William James episode, these are 2 essays on a certain blindness in human beings and what makes a life significant, that William James regarded as among his most important writings. I'm not sure that most readers of William James today look at these essays and think they're among his most important. They deal with sort of moral questions, and I think William James was really, his interest was really in moral questions, although he talked about a whole great many things. This sort of content really interested him. But I disagree with some of the premises that he puts forward here. And we'll get into that as what exactly I disagree with him about. And it should be kept in mind that these are written to be presented as lectures to students. What age students they are, I'm not certain. I would imagine you're probably looking at high school students and possibly college students. I don't know exactly who he delivered those lectures to, but they're kind of like not deep or complex philosophy, or anything like that. It's really just statements about the way people are and the way people should be and things like that. So like all my episodes, I'm going to jump in here and read a couple of sections from both of these essays, see if I can draw some conclusions and possibly push back against some of his assertions or find some spots where he says something that I really agree with, which there are a few in here as well. But I have to say most of the general thrust of this, I'm a little skeptical about his argument. And maybe I don't understand his argument, but as much as I understand it, I'm a little skeptical of what he's saying here. Now, these essays were published in 1899, which was a good, important year for James. He published Talks to Teachers and Talks to Students, bound up together in one book. And he delivered a lecture at Berkeley that was very popular, well received, and that's the lecture that is generally considered to be the introduction to pragmatism, introducing pragmatism to the world at large. He made that lecture really about what pragmatism is, and I reviewed that one 2 episodes ago in my last William James book, The Heart of William James. So yeah, big year. William James is in his prime, and he's delivering these speeches. He's put out a couple of successful books. Will to Believe, obviously, his immensely successful psychology textbooks had come out within the past decade, and he was doing tours and stuff. So he was a very popular, well-known writer at this time, and he was really only just hitting his stride. He still had certainly had more books to write over the next decade. He would live for about 10 more years after 1899, and published several additional books, a lot of other essays. And so this was like his prolific period. You know, he didn't really hit his stride until a little bit later in life. So he really only had what amounts to 2 decades of prolific writing. So let me jump right in. This first essay on a certain blindness in human beings, I want to read a section here where he kind of describes what this blindness is that he's talking about. He says, quote, "We are practical beings, each of us with limited functions and duties to perform. Each is bound to feel intensely the importance of his own duties and the significance of the situations that call these forth. But this feeling is in each of us a vital secret, for sympathy with which we vainly look to others. The others are too much absorbed in their own vital secrets to take an interest in ours. Hence the stupidity and injustice of our opinions, so far as they deal with the significance of alien lives. Hence the falsity of our judgments, so far as they presume to decide in an absolute way on the value of other persons' conditions or ideals. Take our dogs and ourselves, connected as we are by a tie more intimate than most ties in this world, and yet, outside of that tie of friendly fondness, how insensible, each of us, to all that makes life significant for the other. We, to the rapture of bones under hedges or smells of trees and lampposts, they to the delights of literature and art. As you sit reading the most moving romance you ever fell upon, what sort of a judge is your fox terrier of your behavior? With all his goodwill toward you, the nature of your conduct is absolutely excluded from his comprehension. To sit there, like a senseless statue, when you might be taking him to walk or throwing sticks for him to catch, what queer disease is this that comes over you every day, of holding things and staring at them like that for hours together, paralyzed of motion and vacant of all conscious life? The African savages came nearer the truth, but they too missed it, when they gathered wonderingly round one of our American travelers who, in the interior, had just come into possession of a stray copy of the New York Commercial Advertiser, and was devouring it column by column. When he got through, they offered him a high price for the mysterious object, and, being asked for what they wanted it, they said, for an eye medicine, that being the only reason they could conceive of for the protracted bath which he had given his eyes upon its surface. The spectator's judgment is sure to miss the root of the matter and to possess no truth. The subject judged knows a part of the world of reality, which the judging spectator fails to see, knows more while the spectator knows less. And wherever there is conflict of opinion and difference of vision, we are bound to believe that the truer side is the side that feels the more and not the side that feels the less. End quote. So he's basically saying, like, we take our own world, our own concerns, and we make them primary. Our own things that we're interested in, our tasks, our duties, our feelings, our inner life are important to us, and we judge them in a way as more important than the things that other people are interested in, at least to us, right? I am ultimately more concerned with the affairs of my life than with the affairs of somebody else's life. And that's not really like some sort of failure on my part to judge things more importantly that concern me than that concern some other person. That's our constitution. It's how we're built. He says a good example is like your dog. You could sit and read a book, the most moving romance. You're brought to tears by something. Your dog does not understand, no matter how much fondness there is between you. The dog doesn't get it. Why is this person sitting there motionless, staring at this paper thing and not speaking, not doing anything? The dog doesn't get it. And he mentions like people from Africa who aren't familiar with the written word, who live, very primitive people from Africa who wanted to get the magazine that a white person was reading because they thought it would probably be beneficial eye medicine. That was how accurate any of this is. I don't know. I don't know where he gets this story from, but the idea being that was the best of their understanding of what the person is sitting there staring at this magazine for is some sort of eye medicine. But what is interesting is where he says that the person being judged, the person who is, there's the person who is the spectator watching somebody else, and then there's the person who's experiencing whatever it is that's being judged. The person who's the subject, the person who's experiencing the life, knows that life in a way that the spectator, who's observing the life of somebody else, never really knows. The spectator never gets it as fully and completely and richly and profoundly as the person who is living it. But this can spiral out of control because he says, wherever there's a conflict of opinion and difference of vision, we're bound to believe that the truer side is the side that feels the more and not the side that feels the less. Well, that's an odd conclusion to draw here, right? That if you feel something very strongly, it's because you're closer to the truth. That's a sort of a leap to make. And I'm not certain that he intends it to mean simply that whoever has the most powerful emotions on a particular subject is the one who is right. But it can very easily be interpreted that way. When he says, I'll read this last section again, and you tell me whether you think it could be misinterpreted, where he says, the spectator's judgment is sure to miss the root of the matter and to possess no truth. The subject judged knows a part of the world of reality, which the judging spectator fails to see, knows more while the spectator knows less, and wherever there's a conflict of opinion and difference of vision, we are bound to believe that the truer side is the side that feels the more and not the side that feels the less. So that last sentence does sort of lead into the idea that experiencing something profoundly, because it's involving you, is going to give you a more accurate view of the circumstances or situation than somebody who is observing from outside. They're going to know less about the circumstances. They're also going to feel it less. They're going to be less emotionally invested in it. And so they will both understand it less and be less emotionally invested in it. But that doesn't imply necessarily that emotional investment always is paired up with with accurate understanding of circumstances. So we should just be careful not to let one conclusion lead into the other. Now, in this essay, James quotes several people at length. One of them is Robert Louis Stevenson, one is Richard Jefferies, and I want to read a little bit about those. I want to read a little bit of what James is quoting here because I think it's pretty interesting, and it does, I think, a bit to actually counter some of the things that James is saying, or even some of the things that he says in the next essay, which I'll get to in a little bit. But first, where he quotes extensively from Robert Louis Stevenson, he says, quote, "Wherever a process of life communicates an eagerness to him who lives it, there the life becomes genuinely significant. Sometimes the eagerness is more knit up with the motor activities, sometimes with the perceptions, sometimes with the imagination, sometimes with reflective thought, but wherever it is found, there is the zest, the tingle, the excitement of reality. And there is importance, in the only real and positive sense in which importance ever anywhere can be." Robert Louis Stevenson has illustrated this by a case drawn from the sphere of the imagination in an essay which I really think deserves to become immortal, both for the truth of its matter and the excellence of its form. "Toward the end of September," Stevenson writes, "when school time was drawing near and the nights were already black, we would begin to sally from our respective villas, each equipped with a tin bull's-eye lantern. The thing was so well known that it had worn a rut in the commerce of Great Britain, and the grocers, about the due time, began to garnish their windows with our particular brand of luminary. We wore them, buckled to the waist upon a cricket belt, and over them, such was the rigor of the game, a buttoned top-coat. They smelled noisomely of blistered tin. They never burned aright, though they would always burn our fingers. Their use was not, the pleasure of them, merely fanciful, yet a boy with a bull's-eye under his top-coat asked for nothing more. The fishermen used lanterns about their boats, and it was from them, I suppose, that we had got the hint, but theirs were not bull's-eyes, nor did we ever play at being fishermen. The police carried them at their belts, and we had plainly copied them in that, yet we did not pretend to be policemen. Burglars, indeed, we may have had some haunting thought of, and we had certainly an eye to past ages, when lanterns were more common, and to certain storybooks, in which we had found them to figure very largely. But take it for all in all, the pleasure of the thing was substantive, and to be a boy with a bull's-eye under his topcoat was good enough for us. When two of these asses met, there would be an anxious, 'Have you got your lantern?' and a gratified, 'Yes!' That was the shibboleth, and very needful too, for, as it was the rule to keep our glory contained, none could recognize a lantern-bearer unless, like the polecat, by the smell. 4 or 5 would sometimes climb into the belly of a 10-man lugger, with nothing but the thwarts above them, for the cabin was usually locked, or chose out some hollow of the links, where the wind might whistle overhead. Then the coats would be unbuttoned and the bull's-eye discovered. And in the checkering glimmer, under the huge windy hall of the night, and cheered by a rich steam of toasting tinware, these fortunate young gentlemen would crouch together in the cold sand of the links, or on the scaly bilges of the fishing boat, and delight them with inappropriate talk. Woe is me that I cannot give some specimens, but the talk was but a condiment, and these gatherings themselves only accidents in the career of the lantern-bearer. The essence of this bliss was to walk by yourself in the black night, the slide shut, the top-coat buttoned, not a ray escaping, whether to conduct your footsteps or to make your glory public, a mere pillar of darkness in the dark. And all the while, deep down in the privacy of your fool's heart, to know you had a bull's-eye at your belt, and to exult and sing over the knowledge. It is said that a poet has died young in the breast of the most stolid. It may be contended, rather, that a somewhat minor bard, in almost every case, survives, and is the spice of life to his possessor. Justice is not done to the versatility and the unplumbed childishness of man's imagination. His life, from without, may seem but a rude mound of mud. There will be some golden chamber at the heart of it, in which he dwells delighted. For as dark as his pathway seems to the observer, he will have some kind of bull's-eye at his belt. There is one fable that touches very near the quick of life, the fable of the monk who passed into the woods, heard a bird break into song, hearkened for a trill or two, and found himself at his return a stranger at his convent gates, for he had been absent 50 years, and of all of his comrades there survived but one to recognize him. It is not only in the woods that this enchanter carols, though perhaps he is native there. He sings in the most doleful places. The miser hears him and chuckles, and his days are moments. With no more apparatus than an evil-smelling lantern, I have evoked him on the naked links. All life that is not merely mechanical is spun out of two strands, seeking for that bird and hearing him. And it is just this that makes life so hard to value, and the delight of each so incommunicable. And it is just a knowledge of this, and a remembrance of those fortunate hours in which the bird has sung to us, that fills us with such wonder when we turn to the pages of the realist. There, to be sure, we find a picture of life, insofar as it consists of mud and of old iron, cheap desires and cheap fears, that which we are ashamed to remember, and that which we are careless whether we forget. But of the note of that time-devouring nightingale we hear no news. Say that we came, in such a realistic romance, on some such business as that of my lantern-bearers on the links, and described the boys as very cold, spat upon by flurries of rain, and drearily surrounded, all of which they were, and their talk as silly and indecent, which it certainly was. To the eye of the observer, they are wet and cold and drearily surrounded, but ask themselves, and they are in the heaven of a recondite pleasure, the ground of which is an ill-smelling lantern. For, to repeat, the ground of a man's joy is often hard to hit. It may hinge at times upon a mere accessory, like the lantern. It may reside in the mysterious inwards of psychology. It has so little bond with externals that it may even touch them not. And the man's true life, for which he consents to live, lie together in the field of fancy. In such a case, the poetry runs underground. The observer, poor soul with his documents, is all abroad. For to look at the man is but to court deception. We shall see the trunk from which he draws his nourishment, but he himself is above and abroad in the green dome of foliage, hummed through by winds and nested in by nightingales. And the true realism were that of the poets, to climb after him like a squirrel and catch some glimpse of the heaven in which he lives. And the true realism, always and everywhere, is that of the poets, to find out where joy resides and to give it a voice far beyond singing. For to miss the joy is to miss all. In the joy of the actors lies the sense of any action. That is the explanation. That is the excuse. To one who has not the secret of the lanterns, the scene upon the links is meaningless, and hence the haunting and truly spectral unreality of realistic books. In each, we miss the personal poetry, the enchanted atmosphere, the rainbow work of fancy that clothes what is naked and seems to ennoble what is base. In each, life falls dead like dough, instead of soaring away like a balloon into the colors of sunset. Each is true, each inconceivable, for no man lives in the external world among salts and acids, but in the warm, phantasmagoric chamber of his brain, with the painted windows and the storied wall. These paragraphs are the best thing I know in all Stevenson." End quote. So you can see that William James does provide an extensive, almost the entirety of what I just read, is an extensive quote from Robert Louis Stevenson, where he talks about two things. Number one, the boys with the bullseye lanterns at their belts. Number two is the nightingale that sings in the woods. And just to recap, there's these boys, Stevenson counts himself as one of them, that when he was young, these boys would get their hands on a bullseye lantern, which I guess is it's a lantern that with a very, rather than an all-around 360-degree light, it operates like a flashlight. But it's not a flashlight, it's a lantern with a flame but it's built in such a way that it shines like a bullseye. So they've got the boys have these bullseye lanterns. They clip them to their belts, and then they wear a buttoned-up top coat over the lantern, and it's probably bulky. I don't know these lanterns, how big and bulky they are, but it's potentially kind of bulky. A lit lantern shining its light. And that's probably the whole point, is that they're not walking around with unlit lanterns. They're walking around with lit lanterns under their coats. The whole point is that the lantern is hidden. No one else can see them. They specifically don't walk around with their lanterns shining bright. He says it would be really useful when they're walking alone in the dark, a pillar of darkness in the dark with their dark button-up coat, to have the lantern light their way. But it's not released. It's not revealed. It's sort of a secret. And they ask each other, have you got your lantern? Yes, I've got my lantern. They've all got their lanterns, and they meet up in a sort of secret meeting of lantern bearers. And they get together, and some of this stuff is, I don't entirely understand. I'm not a fisherman. I don't know what exactly he means by the links, where he's talking about the various places where they would gather. But it seems to be in boatyards. They'd gather in boatyards, in the scaly bilges of fishing boats, and they would engage in inappropriate talk. He doesn't have any examples, but presumably they're telling each other dirty jokes or something. I don't know what they're talking about, but they're sort of, it's like there are no adults around to judge them or to scold them, and it's a secret club. It's these boys and their secret lantern bearers club. They gather for their secret meetings, and they in a secret location. Nobody knows they have the lantern, but something about the boy's heart soars at the knowledge that he has a lantern at his belt. Like there's something that he values about having the lantern, and not just, I would say, having the lantern, but having the lantern and not have the normies know that he has a lantern. He's kind of like part of a secret club that nobody knows about. So it's not just the fact that he has the lantern alone. It's the privateness of the lantern, and it's the sharing of the private. Like one boy with a lantern under his top coat might not entirely bring about the same sort of feeling in these boys as it does when they know there's a group of them and they've all got their shared secret. And then he talks about the nightingale in the woods, and he says it's kind of like there was this fable about a monk who goes into the woods and he hears a nightingale singing, and he stops to listen to the nightingale, and he comes back to his monastery and he finds that 50 years have passed. Nobody even is there anymore who was there before. They've passed away, or they don't recognize him. Only one person recognizes him. And he goes on from there to talk about, like, that's really where everybody's got their own sort of nightingale that they're after. And one thing that he says that's interesting, it's like every person's kind of got their own nightingale, their own private song that makes time stop, their own inner feeling of bliss and joy, something that is definitely inner in a way of experiencing beauty that belongs to each person on their own. It's a private thing. Like this nightingale is a sort of a private bliss of the monk. And he says all life that is not merely mechanical is spun out of two strands, seeking for the bird and hearing him. He says it's not only in the woods, but the bird sings in the most doleful places. The bird sings to the miser. The bird sings in the gutters or at the highest heights. The bird is always somewhere just around the corner and presenting a beautiful song, but it's not always there, right? Part of the essence of life is seeking the bird, but it's not that the bird is never found, right? It's two strands, seeking the bird and hearing the bird. And he says it's a remembrance of the fortunate hours in which the bird has sung to us that fills us with such wonder when we turn to the pages of the realist. So he's contrasting this to sort of realist who only looks at the external things, who only sees the boy with the top coat, who only sees the mud and the iron and the salts and acids, the material things, which is presented as sort of base and unworthy, a sort of rudeness, a sort of ugly rudeness of the day-to-day, and the realist misses out on something more profound that is in the private, hidden life of people. He says, in some cases, the inner world of the nightingale doesn't touch the outer world at all, and a person's entire joy is bound up inside his head and has no point of contact with the outer world. And this is the case. He says, in such case, the poetry runs underground. A person's meaning for life, the reason for getting out of bed in the morning, the thing that brings him or her joy, is entirely internal. But he also says that even in the most dry realist, there exists somewhere deep within a poet, a bard. He says, his life from without may seem but a rude mound of mud, but always there will be some golden chamber at the heart of it, in which he dwells delighted. For as dark as his pathway seems to the observer, he will have some kind of bullseye at his belt. In other words, everybody has this sort of golden chamber inside, under the top coat, buttoned up, invisible for the external world to see, but some inner chamber, some inner place where he has a sort of private inner joy, despite how dry and dismal and dreary and unemotional somebody may seem from the outside. So with all that said, let me jump to the next section here. When he writes, he quotes another writer named Richard Jefferies, and here he says, quote, Richard Jefferies has written a remarkable autobiographic document entitled The Story of My Heart. It tells, in many pages, of the rapture with which, in youth, the sense of the life of nature filled him. On a certain hilltop, he says, I was utterly alone with the sun and the earth. Lying down in the grass, I spoke in my soul to the earth, the sun, the air, and the distant sea, far beyond sight. With all the intensity of feeling which exalted me, all the intense communion I held with the earth, the sun and sky, the stars hidden by the light, with the ocean, in no manner can the thrilling depth of these feelings be written. With these I prayed, as if they were the keys of an instrument. The great sun burning with light, the strong earth, dear earth, the warm sky, the pure air, the thought of ocean, the inexpressible beauty of all filled me with a rapture, an ecstasy, an inflatus. With this inflatus, too, I prayed. The prayer, this soul emotion, was in itself not for an object, it was a passion. I hid my face in the grass. I was wholly prostrated. I lost myself in the wrestle. I was rapt and carried away. Had any shepherd accidentally seen me lying on the turf, he would only have thought I was resting a few minutes. I made no outward show. Who could have imagined the whirlwind of passion that was going on in me as I reclined there? Surely a worthless hour of life when measured by the usual standards of commercial value, yet in what other kind of value can the preciousness of any hour, made precious by any standard, consist? If it consists not in feelings of excited significance, like these, engendered in someone by what the hour contains. Yet so blind and dead does the clamor of our own practical interest make us to all other things, that it seems almost as if it were necessary to become worthless as a practical being, if one is to hope to attain any breadth of insight into the impersonal world of worths as such, to have any perception of life's meaning on a large objective scale. Only your mystic, your dreamer, or your insolvent tramp or loafer can afford so sympathetic an occupation which will change the usual standards of human value in the twinkling of an eye, giving to foolishness a place ahead of power, and laying low in a minute the distinctions which it takes a hard-working conventional man a lifetime to build up. You may be a prophet at this rate, but you cannot be a worldly success. Walt Whitman, for instance, is accounted by many of us a contemporary prophet. He abolishes the usual human distinctions, brings all conventionalisms into solution, and loves and celebrates hardly any human attributes save those elementary ones, common to all members of the race. For this he becomes a sort of ideal tramp, a rider on omnibus tops and ferry boats, and considered either practically or academically a worthless, unproductive being. His verses are but ejaculations, things mostly without subject or verb, a succession of interjections on an immense scale. He felt the human crowd as rapturously as Wordsworth felt the mountains, felt it as an overpoweringly significant presence, simply to absorb one's mind, in which should be business sufficient and worthy to fill the days of a serious man. End quote. So here we see Richard Jefferies' experience laying in the grass. And it's from his autobiography, Richard Jefferies' autobiography. He describes this scene where he's just laying with his face in the grass. And he's experiencing all these powerful emotions. He's like communing with nature. He's thinking about how beautiful nature is, how powerful, how majestic, how vast. He's in awe of reality and nature and all of the powerful emotions that contemplating this brings to the fore. His reflection just brings him into this state of ecstasy. But he's just laying in the grass. And he says if a shepherd had walked by, he'd have had no clue what he was experiencing internally. And then after the quote, James comes back and says, from an objective, material examination, you could just say that was a worthless hour. The hour this guy spent laying in the grass, buried his face in the grass, feeling the world, sort of a worthless hour when measured by normal standards. And yet, when measured by more, thoughtful standards, you might say, what could possibly be more precious? What other value is there in an hour? But to experience something mind-blowingly significant like that. In the inner world, it's an incredibly significant hour, although externally, bodily, socially, as far as his productive activity, it's all sort of a meaningless, wasted hour. And he kind of sets up a sort of contradiction here, basically saying that we're so blinded to this sort of inner world by our day-to-day affairs that in order to really get in touch with our inner lives and our the sort of to speak to the nightingale or to hear the nightingale, to experience life in that way, we sort of have to take all of our normal practical things that we do and that we care about. We have to kind of set them aside. He says you have to kind of become like a tramp. He says, only your mystic, your dreamer, or your insolvent tramp or loafer can afford so sympathetic an occupation which will change the usual standards of human value in the twinkling of an eye and give foolishness a place ahead of power. So you kind of have to give up your concern with all of the day-to-day strivings of regular life and give yourself over completely to a different sort of valuing events that transpire, a different way of interpreting the world that requires a sort of just carefree living life as a piece of driftwood mentality or approach to life. You're caring about things. You have to care about things that aren't the sort of things one cares about if one wants to get ahead in life. You can't be Walt Whitman and get ahead in life. Walt Whitman was sort of a tramp. He was a wanderer, a vagabond, apparently. And so there's a kind of a dichotomy here between the practical world and this inner beauty. So those were the sections from On a Certain Blindness. He goes on a little bit more at length talking about this sort of thing, but the next essay I think, is the one that I want to dive into a little bit more deeply, because he references his first essay. Like I said, these two essays really go together. But now what I find interesting is he seems as if he's saying that the blindness that we're talking about, the inability of one person to understand what another person is going through, to recognize, like if you see someone just laying in the grass, if you can't recognize the inner life of this person, right, you only see someone lying in the grass, that's a sort of blindness. If you see somebody walking with his top coat and you don't know about his whole secret world with his bullseye lantern at his belt, that's a sort of blindness that we have. But what gets interesting, and I think is where he really goes wrong, is that blindness isn't necessarily the right phrase here, because we're not talking about like an impairment. You're impaired. If you're blind, you're impaired. There's something you should be able to see, but you can't. There's something wrong. Our inability to understand other people or value other people or to read other people's minds or whatever, that's not really a blindness. That's just the way life is. And obviously he calls it a certain blindness in human beings. He's acknowledging this is something that affects all people, but he does present it as if it's somehow like not right, like a mistake in our Constitution. And it's in the second essay where he really starts, I think, in my opinion, to make this point that it's not, that we're not supposed to be blind in that way. And I think that's where I fundamentally disagree with him. Like if it was me, I would have called the first essay on a certain secretiveness in human beings or something along those lines. The boys didn't want anyone to see their bullseye lantern. And it may be that the kid with his head in the grass doesn't want a wandering shepherd to see into his inner world. Maybe he's only able to experience that by knowing that it's private. He's only able to let himself go in that manner, to let himself completely let go of all of his day-to-day practical concerns and sink into this total transcendent state of mind when he knows that he can kind of do it on his own without his mental processes being judged by anybody. The secretiveness of it is what makes the whole thing possible. And the personalness of it is what makes it possible. And so in this next essay, he says, quote, "In my previous talk on a certain blindness, I tried to make you feel how soaked and shot through life is with values and meanings which we fail to realize because of our external and insensible point of view. The meanings are there for the others, but they are not there for us. There lies more than a mere interest of curious speculation in understanding this. It has the most tremendous practical importance. I wish that I could convince you of it as I feel it myself. It is the basis of all our tolerance, social, religious, and political. The forgetting of it lies at the root of every stupid and sanguinary mistake that rulers over subject peoples make. The first thing to learn in intercourse with others is non-interference with their own peculiar ways of being happy, provided those ways do not assume to interfere by violence with ours. No one has insight into all the ideals. No one should presume to judge them offhand. The pretension to dogmatize about them in each other is the root of most human injustices and cruelties, and the trait in human character most likely to make the angels weep. Every Jack sees in his own particular Jill charms and perfections to the enchantment of which we stolid onlookers are stone cold. And which has the superior view of the absolute truth, he or we? Which has the more vital insight into the nature of Jill's existence as a fact? Is he in excess, being in this matter a maniac, or are we in defect, being victims of a pathological anesthesia as regards Jill's magical importance? Surely the latter. Surely to Jack are the profounder truths revealed. Surely poor Jill's palpitating little life throbs are among the wonders of creation, are worthy of this sympathetic interest, and it is to our shame that the rest of us cannot feel like Jack. For Jack realizes Jill concretely, and we do not. He struggles toward a union with her inner life, divining her feelings, anticipating her desires, understanding her limits, as manfully as he can, and yet inadequately too, for he is also afflicted with some blindness even here. Whilst we, dead clods that we are, do not even seek after these things, but are contented that that portion of eternal fact named Jill should be for us as if it were not. Jill, who knows her inner life, knows that Jack's way of taking it, so importantly, is the true and serious way, and she responds to the truth in him by taking him truly and seriously too. May the ancient blindness never wrap its clouds about either of them again. Where would any of us be, were there no one willing to know us as we really are, or ready to repay us for our insight by making a recognizant return? We ought, all of us, to realize each other in this intense, pathetic, and important way. If you say that this is absurd, and that we cannot be in love with everyone at once, I merely point out to you that, as a matter of fact, certain persons do exist with an enormous capacity for friendship and for taking delight in other people's lives, and that such persons know more of truth than if their hearts were not so big. The vice of ordinary Jack and Jill affection is not its intensity, but its exclusions and its jealousies. Leave those out, and you see that the ideal I am holding up before you, however impracticable today, yet contains nothing intrinsically absurd. We have unquestionably a great cloud bank of ancestral blindness weighing down upon us, only transiently riven here and there by fitful revelations of the truth. It is vain to hope for this state of things to alter much. Our inner secrets must remain, for the most part, impenetrable by others, for beings as essentially practical as we are necessarily short of sight. But if we cannot gain much positive insight into one another, cannot we at least use our sense of our own blindness to make us more cautious in going over the dark places? Cannot we escape some of those hideous ancestral intolerances and cruelties and positive reversals of the truth? End quote. So here's, I think, where he starts to lay out his thesis and where he starts really going astray. This is the very beginning of this essay, and he jumps in, starts talking about Jack and Jill. Well, not immediately, because before he gets to that, he basically says that the forgetting of the fact that that we have a sort of blindness to one another, that there are meanings for some people that others don't understand, don't experience the deep meanings that one person experiences and another doesn't experience. And the forgetting of this fact, he says, lies at the root of every stupid, sanguinary mistake rulers over subject people make. And a little libertarian aside here, where he says the first thing that we should learn when we interact with other people is that we should not interfere with their peculiar ways of being happy, assuming they don't interfere with ours, sort of live and let live. And there's some degree of value to that. It's not an absolute ideal to which all other ideals must bow down, but there's some use and value in the premise that my freedom ends where your freedom begins, or whatever. We should try to have a scenario or a society where you maximize the amount of freedom that you have as long as you're not interfering with other people. None of it, non-interfering with other people. Let every person find their own way in life. Don't tread on them. What have you? There is a bit of a libertarian tone to that a little bit, but what really goes wrong is when he talks about Jack and Jill. Because I would surmise that, in truth, Jill probably doesn't want every person in the world to see her the way Jack does. That somehow the rest of us are blind to the truth of Jill's inner world, in a way that Jack is not. And he says Jack still has a little bit of blindness. He's not completely able to totally understand the truth of Jill's inner world because they're not the same person. And they've each got, their own worlds, and we can't have our own world in its entirety and our neighbor's world in its entirety and everyone else's world, right? We're limited by, the nature of the human mind. But I think that Jill probably doesn't want everyone to understand. She may appreciate the fact that Jack has this understanding, but that's something special and unique. And if everybody understood her the way Jack does, what makes Jack so special? He's not, right? So he says, you may hear this and you may say, well, we can't be in love with everybody. That's not realistic. And he says, actually, it's really not that far-fetched. Some people out there really are all about other people. And there's just there's like a root of modern liberalism in here that we're like flawed beings in any way that our empathy for other people is constrained. That's a personal flaw. And what we're supposed to be, if we weren't blind and flawed and broken people, is we would be in a state of permanent, transcendent oneness with other people. We would be overflowing with emotional empathy for other people. We would be always stopping to think about other people. And if you were to lift all the blindness, why would we prefer? Why would Jack prefer Jill over Jane or Janet? Why would parents prefer their child over another child? Why would someone prefer his brother to a stranger? The ties that bind us together as family units and as societies and stuff, they all depend on a sort of exclusivity, right? A family is a unit of people that share something with one another that they don't share with other people who aren't in the family. If they share the same thing and the same feelings and affections that they have for their family members, they share those same feelings for everybody else, and all people feel that way, you really have eliminated the family as anything but potentially a practical phenomena, if that. So the elimination of this sort of blindness and the embrace of this total empathy is, in a way, a kind of destructive phenomena and impractical, and most importantly of all, just flies in the face of human nature. And I think that William James, he doesn't really make an awful lot in his writings about conforming with human nature, but in a sense he does, because the very same book, Talks to Teachers, that these Talks to Students are included in, that book, Talks to Teachers, talks a lot about human nature. It talks a lot about the way people are, what he's learned about the way people are from his time as a psychology professor and his studies into psychology. And he takes what he's learned about human nature and he presents it to teachers and says, here, you can use this knowledge about human nature to teach students. You can employ the nature of your students to your advantage and to their advantage in the teaching process. And so, in a sense, there's a practical aspect to conforming to human nature, and there's an impractical aspect and a self-defeating aspect when, let's say, teachers decide that they're not going to teach students according to the way the students actually are, the way they learn, the way their minds work, but instead the teacher is going to teach them as if they were robots or something, and that in a better world, the students would all be robots, or whatever it may be. I'm just throwing an example out there, but the idea that the students are somehow not correct, their nature, whatever it may be, is flawed, and they should be learning according to some principle that treats them as something other than what they are. That seems like it would be a counterproductive and failing method of teaching. I mean, that's why William James is giving these lectures. He says you're going to teach more effectively when you conform to human nature, when you understand the nature of your students and you allow them to live with their nature rather than try to force them to live in some way that doesn't conform with their nature. So he does, in a sense, argue for the practical value of learning about, recognizing, and employing human nature in our objectives. But then it comes to this blindness, and it totally is. It seems as if this is not some part of human nature that should be welcomed or embraced or utilized or otherwise recognized, but it's treated as an ancestral blindness, something that is at the root of all of our various conflicts and injustices and everything else. And that secretiveness of the lantern under the top coat, the privateness of the face in the grass on the hill, the fact that the monk was by himself when he heard the nightingale. He'd spent his whole life in the monastery with other people, and he ventured out alone, and that was when he heard the nightingale. It's a private phenomena. He talks in the previous essay about how much of it is completely inside somebody's head. The real joy, the spark, the zest for life, in some cases lives entirely in someone's head. And in most cases, it lives largely in one's head, although it's bound up with other, things that we do. And the privateness of it, the innerness of it, the exclusiveness of it, that's all just like important parts of how the human mind works. And I don't understand why he wants to make this argument that something so fundamental to how people operate is really like the cause of a tremendous amount of strife and conflict and problems. I just don't think that he takes the right approach in that regard. So let me continue on here. He talks about this town called Chautauqua. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I think it's Chautauqua. So he says, quote, "A few summers ago, I spent a happy week at the famous assembly grounds on the borders of Chautauqua Lake. The moment one treads that sacred enclosure, one feels oneself in an atmosphere of success. Sobriety and industry, intelligence and goodness, orderliness and ideality, prosperity and cheerfulness pervade the air. It is a serious and studious picnic on a gigantic scale. Here you have a town of many thousands of inhabitants, beautifully laid out in the forest and drained, equipped with means for satisfying all the necessary lower and most of the superfluous higher wants of man. You have a first-class college in full blast. You have magnificent music, a chorus of 700 voices, with possibly the most perfect open-air auditorium in the world. You have every sort of athletic exercise, from sailing, rowing, swimming, bicycling, to the ball field, and the more artificial doings which the gymnasium affords. You have kindergartens and model secondary schools. You have general religious services and special clubhouses for the several sects. You have perpetually running soda water fountains and daily popular lectures by distinguished men. You have the best of company and yet no effort. You have no zymotic diseases, no poverty, no drunkenness, no crime, no police. You have culture, you have kindness, you have cheapness, you have equality. You have the best fruits of what mankind has fought and bled and striven for under the name of civilization for centuries. You have, in short, a foretaste of what human society might be were it all in the light, with no suffering and no dark corners. I went in curiosity for a day. I stayed for a week, held spellbound by the charm and ease of everything, by the middle-class paradise, without a sin, without a victim, without a blot, without a tear. And yet, what was my own astonishment on emerging into the dark and wicked world again to catch myself, quite unexpectedly and involuntarily saying, "Oof, what a relief! Now for something primordial and savage," even though it were as bad as an Armenian massacre, to set the balance straight again. This order is too tame, this culture too second-rate. this goodness too uninspiring, this human drama without a villain or a pang, this community so refined that ice cream and soda water is the utmost offering it can make to the brute animal and man. This city simmering in the tepid lakeside sun, this atrocious harmlessness of all things, I cannot abide with them. Let me take my chances again in the big outside worldly wilderness with all its sins and sufferings. There are the heights and depths, the precipices of the steep ideals, the gleams of the awful and the infinite, and there is more hope and help 1,000 times than in this dead level and quintessence of every mediocrity. Such was the sudden right-about face performed for me by my lawless fancy. There had been spread before me the realization, on a small sample scale, of course, of all the ideals for which our civilization had been striving: security, intelligence, humanity, and order. And here was the instinctive, hostile reaction, not of the natural man, but of a so-called cultivated man, upon such a utopia. There seemed thus to be a self-contradiction and paradox somewhere, which I, as a professor drawing a full salary, was in duty bound to unravel and explain if I could. End quote. So here I'm not going to say too much about this. He's really just kind of laying the groundwork for things he says as he goes on. But the point is, he's in this place, Chautauqua, and it's this like really nice upstate New York town. It's kind of like the quintessential Northeast upper middle class. Maybe not like the wealthiest, but I mean, he describes it as middle class, but I think it's probably upper middle class, lower upper class. I don't know. This is a long time ago. I think it's gotten quite upper class since then. But the point is, it's this place where all the problems have been solved, right? Everybody's on board with this, kind of happy, content, comfortable. All of the luxuries of life are there for your benefit. You've got all the schooling, you've got all the music, you've got all the sporting, you've got everything set out for you just right. No strife, no conflict, no crime. Just a sort of the utopia, right? The utopia that we're all supposedly striving after. And he likes it at first. He goes for a day, he likes it. He stays for a week. But then he leaves and he thinks, thank God, I'm finally out of that place. Now I can get back to the struggle of life. Now I can get back to something real and vibrant and, meaningful above and beyond this placid, just sanitized, boring reality that does not speak at all to man's animal nature, the man's desire for struggle. There's no struggle in Chautauqua, and it's ultimately disappointing to him. He says, I need to figure this out. I need to kind of understand what this is all about. He says, quote, I meditated, and first of all, I asked myself what the thing was that was so lacking in this sabbatical city, and the lack of which kept one forever falling short of the higher sort of contentment. And I soon recognized that it was the element that gives to the wicked outer world all its moral style, expressiveness, and picturesqueness, the element of precipitousness, so to call it, of strength and strenuousness, intensity and danger, what excites and interests the looker-on at life, what the romances and the statues celebrate, and the grim civic monuments remind us of, is the everlasting battle of the powers of light with those of darkness, with heroism, reduced to its bare chance, yet ever and anon snatching victory from the jaws of death. But in this unspeakable Chautauqua there was no potentiality of death in sight anywhere, and no point of the compass visible from which danger might possibly appear. The ideal was so completely victorious already that no sign of the previous battle remained, the place just resting on its oars. But what our human emotions seem to require is the sight of the struggle going on. The moment the fruits are being merely eaten, things have become ignoble. Sweat and effort, human nature strained to its uttermost and on the rack, yet getting through alive. and then turning its back on its success to pursue another, more rare and arduous still. This is the sort of thing the presence of which inspires us, and the reality of which it seems to be the function of all the higher forms of literature and fine art to bring home to us and suggest. At Chautauqua, there were no racks, even in the place's historical museum, and no sweat, except possibly the gentle moisture on the brow of some lecturer, or on the sides of some player in the ball field. Such absence of human nature in extremis anywhere seemed then a sufficient explanation for Chautauqua's flatness and lack of zest. But was this not a paradox well calculated to fill one with dismay? It looks, indeed, thought I, as if the romantic idealists, with their pessimism about our civilization, were, after all, quite right. An irremediable flatness is coming over the world. Bourgeoisie and mediocrity, church sociables and teachers' conventions are taking the place of the old heights and depths and romantic chiaroscuro. And to get human life in its wild intensity, we must, in future, turn more and more away from the actual and forget it, if we can, in the romancers or the poet's pages. The whole world, delightful and sinful as it may still appear for a moment to one just escaped from the Chautauquan enclosure, is nevertheless obeying more and more just those ideals that are sure to make of it in the end a mere Chautauqua assembly on an enormous scale. What in song should live must in life perish. Even now, in our own country, correctness, fairness, and compromise for every small advantage are crowding out all other qualities. The higher heroisms and the old rare flavors are passing out of life. End quote. So I do like that section where he's talking about, when he talks about something missing from Chautauqua, he says it's really the struggle. It's the struggle for victory over challenges, and the sweat, the labor, even the risk of suffering, the conflict, and the challenge of life is what's really missing from Chautauqua. He says Chautauqua's achieved its objective and is just resting on its oars. It's just like eating the fruits, that of its previous victories, but it's not undergoing any current struggles. And he's really saying that once a society has accomplished all of its goals like that, all the zest for life is gone. It's not struggling for success, and so life is just becomes a little boring and meaningless. And he says that unfortunately Chautauqua is spreading across the whole of the world. Everywhere is becoming the same sort of bland sense of nothing more to do, nothing more to struggle for, nothing more to strive for. We've already accomplished it all, and now we can just rest. The whole world is becoming like that, and it's becoming flat and kind of meaningless. He says, even now in our own country, correctness, fairness, and compromise for every small advantage are crowding out all other qualities. The higher heroisms and the old rare flavors are passing out of life. And I'm sure that conservative right-wing listeners can probably hear that and recognize something valuable and meaningful, whether you're the Nietzschean vitalist or not. You could probably see that there is, in fact, something valuable in the struggle. There is something valuable in heroism, right? No heroes are made at Chautauqua in its flatness. There might be distinguished personalities, but there are no heroes because there are no dragons to slay anymore in Chautauqua. So I actually really agree with some of his statements here. I'm sure Chautauqua is very nice, and it's kind of nice to see the fruits of civilization without having to. I mean, we don't want to have to concern ourselves that we're going to get mugged or stabbed or shot or punched in the face on our way to the corner store, to get a gallon of milk. We don't want necessarily to live under constant threat from our neighbors. We don't want to live, in a war zone. We don't want to have to live in place. We want to have a home that's safe that we can go to and raise a family in, and not have to face constant danger walking to school, right? I mean, there's certain values in having like a functional civilization, a high trust society where we don't have to worry about like, you know, the fight for the existence of the future of America. We don't have to necessarily worry that we're in the process of being conquered by foreign peoples. We don't necessarily want to have to live in a world where, you know, where there's danger everywhere and it sort of becomes out of control. We're in the process of a struggle that we don't seem to be winning. There's something to be said for like winning and for just sitting in the spot where it's like, okay, now we have done what we set out to do. Now we can have a peaceful society. Like it might look really, it might look really kind of stale and unimpressive when you feel that the heroism and the vigor of life is sort of fading away everywhere, and it might be sort of disturbing to say, oh, we're all going to become this boring place where there is no real challenge left. There are no dragons left to slay. But like when the dragon's eating your face, or eating the face of your family, it certainly becomes a little bit more realistic to say, I don't want to live like this. So somehow, somewhere, a balance must be struck. You know, we don't want to live in, you know, a third world hellhole simply because we enjoy the danger of potentially being eaten by local cannibals. But we also don't want to just become these ticky-tacky, cookie-cutter, kind of conformist, soulless, Chautauqua middle-class liberals. Right? We don't necessarily want to live that life either, because we do like to have something to fight for. You know, and as men, we like to have things, we like the struggle. We like to have a worthy opponent. So I'm sure that a balance must be struck between these things. But at any rate, let me continue from there. One last section here I want to read where he talks about ideals and what an ideal is. He says, quote, "What exactly do we mean by an ideal? Can we give no definite account of such a word? To a certain extent we can. An ideal, for instance, must be something intellectually conceived, something of which we are not unconscious if we have it, and it must carry with it that sort of outlook, uplift, and brightness that go with all intellectual facts. Secondly, there must be novelty in an ideal, novelty at least for him whom the ideal grasps. Sodden routine is incompatible with ideality, although what is sodden routine for one person may be ideal novelty for another. This shows that there is nothing absolutely ideal. Ideals are relative to the lives that entertain them. To keep out of the gutter is for us here no part of our consciousness at all. Yet for many of our brethren it is the most legitimately engrossing of ideals. Now, taken nakedly, abstractly, and immediately, you see that mere ideals are the cheapest things in life. Everybody has them in some shape or other, personal or general, sound or mistaken, high or low. And the most worthless sentimentalists and dreamers, drunkards, shirks, and verse-makers, who never show a grain of effort, courage, or endurance, possibly have them on the most copious scale. Education, enlarging as it does our horizon and perspective, is a means of multiplying our ideals, of bringing new ones into view, and your college professor, with a starched shirt and spectacles, would, if a stock of ideals were all alone by itself enough to render a life significant, be the most absolutely and deeply significant of men. Tolstoy would be completely blind in despising him for a prig, a pedant, and a parody, and all our new insight into the divinity of muscular labor would be altogether off the track of truth. But such consequences as this, you instinctively feel, are erroneous. The more ideals a man has, the more contemptible, on the whole, do you continue to deem him, if the matter ends there for him. And if none of the laboring man's virtues are called into action on his part, no courage shown, no privations undergone, no dirt or scars contracted in the attempt to get them realized. It is quite obvious that something more than the mere possession of ideals is required to make a life significant in any sense that claims the spectator's admiration. Inner joy, to be sure, it may have with its ideals, but that is its own private sentimental matter. To extort from us, outsiders as we are, with our own ideals to look after, the tribute of our grudging recognition, it must back its ideal visions with what the laborers have, the sterner stuff of manly virtue. It must multiply their sentimental surface by the dimension of the active will. If we are to have depth, if we are to have anything cubical and solid in the way of character, the significance of a human life, for communicable and publicly recognizable purposes, is thus the offspring of a marriage of two different parents, either of whom alone is barren. The ideals, taken by themselves, give no reality. The virtues, by themselves, no novelty. End quote. So, just basically sort of saying, he opens up with like, what is an ideal? And I'm not sure he really clearly defines it, but basically it seems as though it is something that you strive towards, something that you think of as like a correct way of being, a correct scenario of things, whether it's an ideal of a potential version of yourself, my ideal version of myself, or an ideal circumstance that I could find myself in. Sort of the things one hopes for and strives for and envisions as the outcome of the struggle, where one wants to wind up. So Chautauqua might be an ideal for someone who's struggling. He says, not, for the members of his audience, he says, staying out of the gutter is not really one of our most cherished ideals. We pay it no mind. We don't have to worry about climbing out of the gutter. But to some people, many people, in fact, keeping yourself alive and fed with food on the table and not falling into any of the various vices that challenge us all the time, that is an ideal. To stay sober is an ideal. To not get evicted from your apartment is an ideal. To make ends meet, to feed your family, can be ideals. Others may have more lofty ideals if they're not in that sort of financial situation. So he says ideals are sort of subjective. There's no one singular ideal. Everybody's kind of got their own. Some people have lots, some people have less. The college professor probably has zillions of ideals, things that he thinks that the way the world should be. And yet somebody who's bound up with all of these ideals and doesn't really do anything to achieve them, doesn't engage in the laborer's virtues, the hard work and so forth, we sort of find that contemptible, right? Someone who's loaded up with ideals and doesn't do anything to achieve them. We also find it sort of contemptible if someone has no real ideals. They don't strive for anything of any real meaning. And he says that make a significant life has to have, a balance of the two, has to have some ideals to it, but isn't made up only of ideals, but also is made up through the application of muscular effort. The combination of those two things is the offspring of that union, is the sort of life that becomes significant. So this is, I think, whether there's a real easy, clear conclusion to be drawn here, particularly from the sections that I've read. I'm not certain that there is, but that is really much of his main point here in what makes life significant, is this sort of merging of, we want to live in Chautauqua because we want to, we don't want to have to we don't want to have to get stabbed in the face on our way to the market, to the corner store. We want to live in a safe society. We want to be able to engage in the athletic sports. We want to go sailing on the lake. We want to listen to the chorus. We want to be able to enjoy the musical presentations. We want all the fruits of civilization, right? We want all the things that a high trust, functional, prosperous society can provide for us. We want the goodies. We want the end results. But we don't want to become like Chautauqua in the sense that, good times make weak men. We don't want to be the weak men created by the good times, but we also don't want to live in the hard times either, because they really are unpleasant when you're in it. When you're hungry and you don't have any food, when you're homeless, let's say, that's not fun. So the hard times aren't where you want to be. And finding that sort of balance where you can have your ideals, you can work towards your ideals, but you have to always keep struggling against something, somehow. Find some new challenge. Find some new land to conquer of some sort. Maybe it's not physical, some new frontier, whether it's traveling to Mars or whatever it may be. Somehow, the synthesis of the ideals and the effort and the practical and the idealistic, that marriage of those two is what really makes a life worth living. And I think that should wrap it up for today. I thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.